Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to the Digital to Dice podcast. I am Dave.
I'm Ron.
And Rod, what is this, episode 182?
182. Don't blink. It's 182.
Oh, that's a good one. That's a good one. Nice job. You've been working on that all week, I can tell.
If the week was the last 25 seconds, yes.
Nice. That's why you're here. Anyway, thanks for joining us here in the Digital to Dice podcast. Way to get a hold of us. Digitaltodice.com is the website. 978-751-DICE is the text line. Digitaltodice@yahoo.com is our email. And over on Facebook, facebook.com/groups/digitaltodice. And if you'd like to be a Patreon of the show and help support the show in any way, patreon.com/digitaltodice. Now, Ron, in this episode here, we have another interview. It's back-to-back interviews.
Yes.
Yeah, this is another good one. We talked with Stephen J. Walker. He is the author of the book, A Whole New Ballgame, the 1969 Washington Senators. And he's also on Pokal Press. If you remember, we had a JT Hetrick on talking about Misfits, baseball's worst team ever. Well, he's on the Pokal Press as well, Mr. Walker is, with his book, A Whole New Ballgame, the 1969 Washington Senators. He's actually got a 50th anniversary edition that just come out that he's going to talk about.
Dick Bosma did the foreword for to one of the pitchers for the Senators as well.
Yeah, so we have a nice conversation with him, and let's get to that interview right now. Joining us on the Dice Line, we have the author Steve Walker, who wrote a book called A Whole New Ballgame, the 1969 Washington Senators. Steve, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Ron. Great to be here.
Thank you.
All right, now before we get into talk a little bit about the Washington Senators and your book and while you get into it, we do have one question that we ask all the guests to come on the show. And that question is, if you could go back in time and attend any sporting event, what would that event be?
Oh, wow.
Not the forfeit before they moved. I know that.
No, it's not that one. Short term, I would love to have been in Houston when the Nationals won the World Series in 2019. I watched it on TV. But I'd have to say the All-Star game in 1969. I would probably pick that one.
In D.C., yeah.
Yeah, it was in D.C. There were so many great players. Frank Howard hit a home run off Steve Carlton and, brought the house down. So it just had everything. Had a great game, great players on both teams. The National League won in a blowout, but still, it would have been a wonderful time to be there. The game got rained out.
Yeah, so last daytime All-Star game, yeah.
I tried to get my dad to take me, but he wouldn't do it. He said it was going to be too crowded. He had to go to work, etc. But that's where I'd want to be, just to soak in that atmosphere, and just be there with all those great. But they were all my childhood heroes: McCovey, Clemente, Howard, on and on and on. That's where I would want to be if I could just pick one.
That's a good one. And now that's when they really played hard in those All-Star games. Was back then, Mm-hmm. Ron did a game on Action PC All-Star game the other day, Ron, on the computer.
Last
and he said it was a collision at the plate. I was like, they don't do that anymore in the All-Star game.
It was the American League was way down. It was during the 2001 season. American League was way down, and Jason Kendall held onto the ball when Derek Jeter tried to pull up Pete Rose. And the National League held on to win 7-5.
Yeah, Rose was a nut. I love watching Rose. He didn't care. He played hard no matter what. Rose was fun to watch.
After he did the thing, I think it was 70, 71?
70. It was at Riverfront.
Yeah. With Ray Fosse. Me and my friends reenacted that for weeks in our backyard.
And so whose mom told you to stop busting up your shoulder?
About 3 of them. They were all home in those days, and word traveled fast.
That's right. Oh, yeah.
All right, Steve, let's turn our attention to the book. So it's called A Whole New Ballgame, the 1969 Washington Senators. So what was the idea behind writing a book about the 1969 Washington Senators?
Well, the interesting thing was I was a Senators fan as a little kid. And then, of course, they moved in 71. I thought, they had a good year in 1969, but I didn't know much about it. And there was a lot of stuff going on with Washington baseball history in the late 90s. In fact, I'm wearing a shirt of the 1998 reunion of the 1969 team. And there was a lot of energy around getting a team back to D.C. And I was working at the Commerce Department at the time when there was a government shutdown. So I said, I always wanted to research this team, so I'm going to just start doing it. And so it took me a while to get the book done, but that's what piqued my interest. Who were these guys? I knew about Frank Howard and Dick Bosman, but who were some of the other guys that I grew up as a kid watching, and what happened that year? And it was, the more I researched it, the more intriguing it was. And then I started interviewing some of the players and the coaches, and it just became even more so because you really had a band of misfits plus Frank Howard with Ted Williams managing them. And they went, 22 game improvement in wins from the prior year. So just a really memorable season, and the last good one in DC before the Nationals got good.
So let's stop for a second. And this was the expansion Senators,
yes,
which came in 1961. The original Nationals or Senators moved to Minneapolis, or moved to Bloomington, and became the Minnesota Twins, where they still are. And then after the 71 season, these Senators, and I didn't realize there was like 4 or 5 different ownership groups for that team in the 10 years. Mm-hmm. Moved to Texas and became the modern day Texas Rangers. And so they were only there 10. So they weren't even, hopefully this doesn't get demonetized, but the bastard stepchild of baseball in Washington. They weren't the original, and they weren't the team that ever became successful, just like the Nats did when they came down from Montreal. So just setting that as a backdrop as we talk about this.
That's all true, Ron. The team was really, really bad. Before 1969, the only decent year was 1967 under Gil Hodges. They actually were in the pennant race till like mid-August, but I think it's because everybody was in the AL.
Right.
And then they faded in September, and of course then they traded Gil Hodges to the Mets in 1968 for players.
That worked out well for the Mets, yeah.
It really did, especially in 69.
Yeah.
A lot of the players I interviewed said Gil Hodges was the guy that sort of taught them what it takes to win. And Ted Williams was able to build off of that foundation that Hodges built.
How did they get Williams to take the job? He never struck me, his personality never struck me as manager material. How did they sucker him in to go with the
No, you're exactly right, Ron. In fact, when Bob Short bought the team in December, he still didn't have a manager in February. And he says, well, I'm going to go after Williams. And like, there's no way, the Yankees tried to get Williams to manage for years. He's not going to do it. He's not going to manage the team in baseball. I mean, this is a fool's errand, and people were making fun of him. But Bob Short's nickname was the Great Persuader. And he had a way of getting people to do things that he wanted them to do. And so he chased Williams down. I have a whole chapter on it in my book. A lot of it is thanks to Shirley Povich, the fantastic writer who was still writing then, and he did an in-depth article on that. But what happened was Short got a hold of his phone number in the Florida Keys and called him.
Oh, I'm sure that went over really well.
Yeah, exactly. And then he said, well, meet me in Atlanta. We'll have a secret meeting. And Williams was like, I don't know. But he finally agreed to meet with them. And Short knew Williams was a pilot from his World War II and Korea days.
Oh.
And Short was chair of the Democratic National Committee then, too, so he had a private jet. So he's like, hey, Ted, let's have a tour of the private jet, sit in the pilot's seat. And he kind of schmoozed him, and he offered him a boatload of money. I forget the exact amount, but it was $100,000 plus a year, I think, for 5 years.
Oh, good money for 69, yeah.
Yeah, very good money, and partial ownership in the team. So he had an ownership stake, and he was guaranteed a front office job if he saw the contract there, which ultimately he didn't. It was a bombshell because the week before, the Washington Redskins had hired Vince Lombardi. And so you have this sports backwater with 2 teams that were really bad. Now you've got the most famous NFL coach and the most famous baseball player, one would argue, now leading your 2 teams. So suddenly DC, I put in the book, they went from a backwater to the front pages of the Sporting News and Sports Illustrated overnight. And so that's how Williams showed up. And it was only a couple weeks till spring training, but they got a reprieve because I think there was a week strike that year. There was a really brief player strike because Marvin Miller had just taken over the head of the union. So it gave him about another week, but they didn't have much time to prepare.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. And of course, this was the only year that they finished above 500 in their decade in Washington. So I'm assuming that a lot of the book is about how the players must have taken to Williams.
Absolutely.
To have that, because usually when you have Larry Bird's a good example too of someone who didn't coach very long but got the most out of his players. I mean, Indiana took the Bulls to a Game 7 of an Eastern Conference final, under Larry Bird, and then Larry didn't really, want to do that much longer and didn't. What did the players think of Williams outside of being in awe that you're sitting there talking to Ted Williams?
They were really thrilled that he was coming in. Really, really excited, especially the hitters. The pitchers are a little bit worried because he didn't think highly of them.
No.
I talked to Dick Bosman, who graciously wrote the foreword for the 50th anniversary.
Oh, nice.
Edition. Yeah, and he's a wonderful guy. And he said, we all were excited that Ted was coming in, even though he banished us pitchers to the backfields to work on our bunting. But a lot of the guys I talked to, Frank Howard and Del Unser were two of the most prominent, said that Williams changed their approach to hitting. With Howard, it was being more patient because he's like, Bush, how in the world can you hit 44 home runs in 1968 and only get 54 walks? Like, what's going on there, pal? And he said, well, Ted, I don't want to take 2 strikes, so I'll strike out 200 times. He says, well, can you lay off a tough pitch? He's like, yeah, I can. He said, well, try it for me. And then Howard's statistics were so much better in 69 and 70, way more walks, fewer strikeouts, didn't lose any power. And he credits Williams for that. And then Del Unser said he was trying to be opposite field singles hitter, use his speed. And Williams said, yeah, but, if you get an inside pitch, look to pull that thing out of the park. And Unser ended up with 7 home runs and 8 triples in 69. He had nowhere near that kind of power. And a lot of the guys had career years under Williams. But the pitchers said he also spent time with them saying, this is how a hitter thinks. So Casey Cox and Dennis Higgins, who was their closer for a while, until Darryl Knowles came back from military service, they said that kind of view into the mindset of a hitter helped them to change the way they pitched. Mm-hmm. And really, if you look at league averages from 68 to 69, the Senators' pitchers improved more than the hitters did because everybody hit better in 69.
Well, they dropped the mound 5 inches.
Yeah.
It was 15 inches, Dave, at 68, and Carl Yastrzemski was the only American League hitter to break 300, hitting 301. And they said, and that was the year that Bob Gibson had the 1.12 ERA and had 9 losses. Imagine that, an earned run average of about 1, and you almost lose 10 games. So they dropped the mound down supposedly to 10, although some places may never have done that still. And so it was much more. It was an expansion year. There was the 4 expansion teams: Seattle Pilots, Kansas City, the Royals, the Expos, and the Padres. So it would have been more watered down anyway, plus that and all that. But to have the pitching improve in a year where you got literally 2 strikes against you is pretty good.
Yeah, it was, when you look at the averages, and, Dick Bosman went from a nobody. In fact, the opening day program had his name as Dave Bosman. Have it right. And if you listen to the Yankees announcers radio broadcast of that opening day, I think it's available on Internet Archive. When Bosman comes into the game to relieve Camilo Pascual, he says into the game for the Senators is Dave Bosman. Oh. So he ends up being the ERA champion at the end of the year. So, and he credits Williams a lot for that. Again, for the not for the technique, but the mindset, the approach to pitching, setting up hitters, that sort of thing.
So, getting back to the beginnings of the book here, when did you get this thought in your head to write the book? When did you start writing, and what kind of research did you need to do for this?
Okay, that's a great question. I started in late 96 and then put it aside for a little while. I have three sons. One wasn't born yet, but the other two were small. But then when the 1998 reunion came out, I got in touch with a guy named Jim Hartley, who's since passed away, sadly. And he was putting together a 1969 Senators reunion in Chantilly, Virginia. And he said, you need to be at this thing and interview some of the players. And so I started there. And then Retro Sheet was also great. Saber was also great. Mm-hmm. Those were some of my go-to sources for research. Also, the Martin Luther King Library had a lot of the Washington newspapers on microfilm. And there was one in Silver Spring as well. So I did a lot of that work. It's easier now. A lot of stuff was only on microfilm, and I got used to using that. And then I had done about 2 or 3 interviews, and I started writing the book. And it was mostly a recap of the season. So, like, if you were to go through the game log and Retro Sheet, I was kind of tracking along with that. And then I stopped and said, this is kind of boring. And if I'm bored, you can bet that people reading it are bored. So I said, and so I talked to a writing instructor. I took a class, and she said, the problem is you don't have enough interviews. You need to get the stories. The things that people want are the stories. They want to get to know these people. And I said, well, why would these guys want to talk to me? She said, come on, Steve. Who doesn't want to be remembered?
Exactly.
What they did is, they said, your biggest issue with these guys is going to be getting them off the phone. They're going to be, I promise you, no one's going to say no to you. And nobody did. And that's when the richness of the book came out. And I said, oh, all right. So I've got to focus on the stories. And so I had to kind of go back and start over, Dave. And that's why it took so long. That's why it didn't come out till 2000. Well, that was one reason. But I focused on the stories, and I start the book at the reunion.
Okay.
Because that's where all the fans were. They sold out 500 tickets in less than a week for a team that hadn't played in 30 years. So there was still a love of the team. And then I sort of go into, I'll tell a story about each player in the context of a game where they starred. For example, the first game back in Boston, Ted Williams desperately, as you can imagine, wanted to win that game.
Oh, I'm sure.
And a guy named Hank Allen, who was sort of a part-time player, he was the star of that game. 3 for 5, 3 runs, great catch to take a home run away in right field. And the Senators won. So Williams got to go out with his Boston buddies and brag, and so I was able to tell that story. And that's really what gives the book a richness, I think, is I interviewed 20 players, a bunch of coaches, and even the bat boy. So that's how I refocused the book. And then getting a publisher, anybody that's ever published, if you don't self-publish, it's tough. And I had 9 rejections. And then I was given a presentation about the team at Saber. And that's when Joseph Hetrick came up to me and said, hey, get your manuscript done as soon as you can and get it to me. Because if I like it, I'm going to publish it. And he did on Pokal Press. So that's sort of the story. And then 10 years later, I'm like, I've got to update this thing. I had gotten access to more pictures, more details about the players after they retired. And so we've updated it. And there were some errors we had to fix too. So we've updated the book. And then I added a epilogue for the World Series victory and the reunion, what Ted Williams said at the reunion that helped bring baseball back. That must have been fun. Going back and kind of redoing it, adding some things that maybe you always wanted to fix a few things, or just kind of like it's like not a do-over per se, but it's a chance to add to something. It must have been fun. It was neat, and doing photos in 2009 was somewhat expensive for a publisher. We wanted to keep the cost of the book under $20, but then 10 years later, it was much easier. And there was a fellow who took over the Washington Baseball History Society from Jim Hartley named Mark Hornbaker, and he had all these pictures he had saved from Photograph Day. The Senators used to have a Photograph Day where kids could go down on the field and get their picture taken with the players before the game, and he had a bunch of them, and those are all in the book, thanks to Mark. And that was just added a richness to it, because you see the players real time, these little kids, that's their heroes, they're on the field. And so that helped. And then, of course, having Dick Bosman write the forward and get his perspective on the year. And a lot of the guys say they still get cards and letters from people that remember 1969 and how much it meant to them. And a lot of the reviews on my book on Amazon mention that as well. So there's still a fire that burns for this team, even though they're kind of in the baseball ether somewhere, unless you bring them back with sports games.
Right.
So, adding to that, have you ever replayed the 1969 season?
I've done it twice.
Okay.
I did it with an early Stratomatic computer version.
Oh, okay.
But I didn't do the as played. It was when Stratomatic came out with their first 1969 cards.
Okay.
And I had Lee May, who joined the team in June, and a few other guys from the get-go that actually were really good players. The Senators had a little bit of trouble in right field till Arthur Lee May showed up, and he was great. So they won 90 games. So they did 4 better. And then I did an as played about 10 years later with the Stratomatic, with the new cards. And I think they won 88 games. So I have done it, and it's really fun because you bring these guys to life. When Frank Howard hits a home run, you can see it in your mind's eye. And as you guys know, Stratomatic's a great game for replays.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we both enjoy it. Now it's time for us to say that we're actually talking with Apple's John Herson this weekend. But yeah, Strata is a great game. So without getting too personal, how old were you in the 1969 season? How much of it do you actually remember when you went to read the book?
I was 7. So
perfect.
Yeah, it was a perfect age. I was just becoming a baseball fan. There was a kid in the neighborhood that was older. He was 3-4 years older than us. And if you didn't like the Washington teams, because my family's from Pennsylvania, and my dad was a Steeler fan, he'd beat you up. So I made the wise decision.
The wise choice
to support all the Washington teams. But my dad took me to my first game in 1969, and it was in July.
Oh, you'll never forget it then.
Yeah, and I looked up on RetroSheet too, because I remember Tim Cullen, of all people, hit a home run, and he hit 10 his whole career. And President Nixon was there with his daughter and son-in-law. And so that was neat to remember that. So the RetroSheet's just a beautiful thing. So that was when I got my first taste of baseball, my first game, and I just fell in love with it.
Nice.
So from the time you started to plan this book out, the first edition, I should say, to the time how long was that? What was the timetable on that?
It was 12 and a half years.
Really?
Yeah, it was a long, long time. Having a family and working full time, I was getting up at like 4:30 in the morning and writing till 5:36.
Oh wow!
Because I was I didn't live in Ellicott City at the time, but I lived in Maryland, commuted to DC, so that was 75 to 90 minutes each way. So the only time I had to write was in the early morning, because when I came home, my wife's like, "Here's the kids, have a nice day."
Your turn.
Yeah, exactly. So it took a while, but the other reason was because my first start of the first draft wasn't the right approach, and so that I lost probably 2-3 years with that, and had to backtrack.
How much of that original version made it into the book? Did you completely scrap it and start over?
I'd say the part where there's the game summaries of what happened, that is still in there. Some of it is embellished by the player interviews because their memories of the games are uncanny. Like Dick Bosman can remember every pitch he's ever thrown.
Wow.
It's just amazing. Like I asked him about a one-hitter he pitched against Cleveland in May 2nd. That was sort of his coming out party. And he's like, yeah, I threw a change up to Tony Horton, and he blooped a single in the right field. I mean, how does he know that? But so that helped too. The interviews helped enrich the part of the books I'd already written, because I had first-hand perspective on it.
So, as a kid, who was Frank Howard your hero from that team? Who was your favorite player witnessing that season firsthand?
My favorite player was Mike Epstein, because I was left-handed.
Yep. I don't think we could talk about his nickname now, but yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Was that the guy from Welcome Back, Kotter? Was that
pretty close? Pretty close, as a matter of fact.
He was a very outspoken guy. He started out on the Orioles, and they sent him down to the minors at one point, and he said, "Sorry, I'm not going." can't make me. I mean, ultimately they did, but the Senators picked him up in a trade. I think 68, maybe 67, and he was sort of under the microscope, being a left-handed power hitter. Ted Williams called him, "This is my protege."
Yeah, no pressure there.
No pressure there. But you know what? He had a great year in 69.
Yes, he did. Yes,
30 home runs, 414 on base. I think a 955 or plus ops. I mean, he hit behind Howard, and Howard helped Howard as well. So he got platooned early. Williams wouldn't play him against lefties, but eventually Howard would take over first. But eventually he started to trust him more, and that was probably his best season. I'm sure he probably would say 72 because he's a world champion with the A's.
Right. He went to Oakland, Dave, and if you ever do those 72 or 73, he's with those teams.
Okay. Okay.
But his stats were by far 69 was by far his best season.
So did you get the chance to interview him?
No.
Oh,
no. He's one of the guys who didn't get back to me.
Okay.
So that was sad not to get to interview him. But
yeah, that was the follow-up question, and then I'll get the chance to ask it.
Yeah, I think he's seen the book and was happy with it. There's a scene in there where they lost a game to the Padres. I'm not Padres, the Pilots in that Sick Stadium. They were up 11-3 and ended up losing 16-13.
Oh,
and so they were all really bummed. And there was a story in a sports magazine about they're leaving the stadium, and he's on the bus down in the dumps, and he sees a kid throwing a baseball against the wall with the glove, and he says, if that kid can enjoy the innocence of baseball, I need to get over this loss and keep going. So I thought that was a neat, kind of heartwarming story. And aside of Epstein, you don't see too much.
Right.
So I included that in the book.
So is there one player that really just kind of captivated you when he interviewed you? Obviously, you had someone write the foreword of your revised edition of your book, but is there one personality that really spoke out to you, or touched a nerve in you when he did all those interviews?
I'd say there were two. The first one was Wayne Terwilliger. He was the third base coach for the Senators, I think, in the 50s. And he talked about how great it was to be with Ted Williams on the whole season. He said, I was coaching third base for the first time. The team was winning, and I was having a beer with Ted Williams, and who could ask for more?
That's pretty, yeah.
Yeah, so that was neat. And then Dave Baldwin was a relief pitcher on the team.
Okay.
And his story was so neat. He was at Arizona State University, and he was a star, the big man on campus. And his arm fell, and he tore his arm up, his elbow. And so he had to rebuild the whole way he pitched. And I think it was 65. He was cut from Houston Astros Durham minor league team, Class D. So you're getting cut by one of the worst teams in the league,
right?
And the lowest rungs of the minor leagues, and he didn't give up. He kept working, taught himself how to pitch, worked with the Senators pitching coach Sid Hudson, who was a somewhat side armor too when he pitched, and he rebuilt his whole approach to pitching. And he wasn't a star, but he wasn't bad. He wasn't a bad right hand relief pitcher in '69 for the team. I think he had a few wins and 4 saves, and he played long enough to earn a pension. So the story behind that is Chuck Tanner brought him up in '73. He had been out of the majors since '70, and he needed, I think, 3 more games. So Tanner put him in to the 3 games. And so this is a guy who, he's not well known, but his story really intrigued me about a lot of the Senators were people who were written off. The whole team was written off. A lot of people were written off. And they overcame all that. So the resilience and the pushing through and not giving up was a theme that kind of runs through the whole book.
Was it easier because everyone knew that Baltimore was just going to run away with it? I mean, at some point,
I'm sorry.
At some point, they must have known, no matter how good they were, that not even in Tom Seaver's wettest dreams did they think that the Orioles would be stopped in '69. So did this just relax and just see what we can do?
I think so. Dick Bosman said that. He said, we knew we weren't going to catch the Orioles, but we really wanted to chase that winning season hard. And they were 500 at the end of July. And what happened was they ended up winning 8 of their last 9. And that's how they got to the 86 wins. They missed out on third place. They had a 3-game series with Boston, and they had to win all 3. and Boston won the first game. And so they finished a game behind the Red Sox, which probably galled Williams to no end.
I'm sure it did.
And third place got money back then, so they missed out on a couple $1,000 per person too. But they won 12 out of 18 versus Boston that year. So Williams, I'm sure, had a lot to do with that. But yeah, I think the Orioles running away with it took a lot of pressure off them. They didn't have to worry about a pennant race; just go out and try to win as many games as they could.
And we are speaking with Steve Walker. He's the author of A Whole New Ball Game, the 1969 Washington Senators. Steve, I got a couple questions for you here. I'm going to go with two parts to this question. One is, what did you learn about the 1969 baseball season while compiling this book? What are some of the things that you learned?
Oh, man, all kinds of stuff. The All-Star game, I wasn't aware that they had picked the all-time greatest teams. I knew about the greatest living player because it was DiMaggio, and they had Nixon hosted all of them at the White House, and Williams didn't show up, I think, in a pique over not being named the greatest living. And DiMaggio, of course, never let him forget about it.
Of course not.
But I didn't know they had picked the all-time teams, and all these guys descended on Washington, for a big dinner. They were at the ballpark. So that was neat. And I had not remembered about the rainout, and that Vice President Agnew had to throw out the first pitch of that game because Nixon was out in the Pacific meeting the astronauts.
Oh, that's right, Apollo 11.
After they splashed down. Yeah. So that was pretty neat. And I also didn't know when they had the expansion, geographically, it was easy for the National League, Montreal in the East, San Diego in the West. But in the American League, they put both teams in the West. And interestingly enough, in 68, the top 5 finishers were Detroit, Baltimore, Cleveland, Boston. Detroit, Baltimore, Boston, New York, Cleveland, all had winning records, and the Senators. So they got lumped in that these teams were, the last 2 World Series winners, or 3 actually. Baltimore 66, Boston 67, Detroit 68. And so the pundits predicted that this is they're going to be the worst team in baseball. They're going to be worse than Seattle and Kansas City because they got to play these great teams. So I learned that. I didn't realize that those 5 teams are so good the year before. I also learned Williams was more patient than people gave him credit for. They lost their first 8 games in spring training. I didn't know that, the Senators. And a lot of people thought Williams was eventually going to be, I can't work with this material. I'm out. I want to go fishing. But he didn't. He never got ejected from a game, which is
really,
yeah. I was he went the whole year. He did later, but not in 1969.
I know that, not to cut you off, but when Kurt Gowdy got the job at NBC when they got baseball in 66, he pleaded with them to take Ted Williams as their color guy. Well, Williams not only drove Fords, and the main sponsor was Chrysler, so that was a non-starter then. But NBC was panicked if they did hire him that they'd have to put him on some sort of delay, that he would just say a naughty word when he wasn't supposed to, and that would have. But yeah, so that's pretty gentlemanly not to do that to do that.
Yeah, I think he used a lot of marine language, but
colorful personality, yes.
But that, and then the Mets, I learned through Stratomatic too. Tom Seaver would say, I don't consider our World Championship an upset. I think we were the best team. We were playing in a better league than the American League, and we had a good team. And usually what you hear is it was the pitching. Baltimore was a dynasty, and the Mets were it just got hot at the right time. But one of the things I learned about their team is Hodges could platoon at every position across the diamond.
Yeah, he was a genius, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so he could always get the matchup, righty-lefty matchup advantage, and he was great at handling a pitching staff. If you ever have the time and the inclination, if you look up the 67 Senators pitching staff under him, they were fantastic. and their ERAs were low. They all pitched very well. So I was kind of almost converted to Seaver's way of thinking, because it was a competitive division. And the other thing was the race in the NL West. That was fabulous. Going to like the last week or two, it was a 5-team race. And the Braves prevailed ultimately, but it was anybody's division there for a while, except for the Padres. So it was a great season, 69. Very memorable in a lot of ways.
The other part of that question is, what did you learn about writing a book?
You have to be passionate about your subject, and you have to be patient and just plow through. And the best advice I got was from a friend. He says, write at least half an hour every day without fail, every day. And he says, before you know it, your book will be written. He was right. And the other thing is, if I was an English major in college, and I have a little bit of an ego about my writing. So I didn't want to self-publish. I just had this thing. I want to get a publisher, and you have to be able to deal with rejection. I got so many, but I got a few where there was a handwritten note. One said, this is a great proposal, but we don't see enough market. And my writing teacher said, that is gold. If they took the time to write, then you've got something that's eventually going to get published. You just got to keep going till you find somebody who will do it. So that perseverance and putting up with rejection, I think, and then the marketing. I'm not a natural marketer. That's a tough thing to do unless you come by it naturally. But we had some book signings and things, and it was fun. It ended up being fun, but it was very intimidating at first.
Have you played 69 as the Mets?
Yes.
Okay, so the gaming part of me, since this is a gaming podcast, would be what's your recommendation to get them to try to match what they did in real life? Because that team on the surface, the Seaver quote says, no, we're the better team. But if you look at that and look how good they were in clutch situations, which Stratton handles fairly well, how do you get that? The pitching is good, but how do you get them to win?
I think what I did was I really went through RetroSheet and studied the moves Hodges made. And I also followed the as-played lineups.
So you don't get Clendenon to start. He's in Montreal.
That's right. Yeah. But when I played, I did a mostly computer game replay with the old Strider. I didn't play every game, but I set the lineups, and with the Sabre knowledge, the Pittsburgh lineup was different than what Larry Shepard, their manager, did. And Pittsburgh was dominant. But if you look at what Shepard did, he didn't do it that way. And so I think if you do the as played, you bake in some of the mistakes managers made back then. That Hodges, I think, was a step ahead of the crowd in terms of platooning and how to use a pitching staff. So I think if you stick to the as played, you can get the Mets farther, and you have to be patient with them. Yeah, because their offense really struggles till Clendenon arrives, and you have to not. What I did the first time I used them was make the platoon switches too soon, and you have to wait till the key moments of the game. And then the other thing is, I thought Tug McGraw was a classic lefty, but he's a reverse. If you look at his schematic card, he is death on righties, and good against lefties, but not dominant. So I thought, oh shoot, I was trying to match him up with lefties. That was a huge mistake. So, but I think you can get the Mets through, but you have to be patient and you have to have some luck, which I think I have to admit they did have some luck. But it's doable.
What would be Baltimore's Achilles heel?
I'd say probably their hitting. If you can keep Frank Robinson in check, and Boog Powell, you can beat them. And Brooks had if I remember right, Brooks at third was all, Gold Glove, but he had a fairly high error rating, I think, in Strat. And so if you can get lucky on the X chart, when I replayed the World Series, Brooks made, I think, 3 errors at really crucial times in that series because I think it was E21 or something kept hitting on the numbers. So
he makes up for it in 70.
Oh yeah. But I mean, Elrod Hendricks, their hitting was really good, but not not dominant like a 27 Yankees.
Right.
So I think that if they have an Achilles heel, that's probably it. And their bullpen's actually pretty good. You just don't need to use them very much.
Yeah, Earl had his workhorses.
Yes.
Here's a question for both of you, actually.
Okay.
Do you think the Senators would have stuck around and not moved if they were a better team?
No, I don't. I'll answer this, and then Steve can correct me. My knowledge of working down, covering the Nationals when I did, Short was what, Steve? The fifth ownership group of that team?
Yeah, fourth or fifth, yeah.
They just were never, ever stable. They might have put it off longer, or at least had them put a roof onto Arlington Stadium when they finally did move down to the Metroplex. But that team was misplaced, I believe, right from the get-go. Washington should not have, hindsight being 2020, Washington should not have gotten an expansion team in 61. They didn't have a stadium. I mean, they finally got it in 62. But as Steve said earlier, I mean, both the Redskins and the Senators were just doormats in their respective leagues, and it was a market that had already been tapped once. I'm not sure if there was pressure from the government to keep a team in D.C. after the Griffiths moved to Minnesota or what, but I have a hard time seeing. I mean, look, the Cracker Jack Alzheimer's game in '82 was America's first look at baseball in D.C., at least from my lifetime. And it took 22 years after that to put a team back into D.C. I think that pretty much, just from my point of view, from covering the Nationals, I mean, yes, it turned out to be a good market, but I think the timing was bad.
Yeah, I'd agree with that to a point. I think.
Yeah, please correct me, because.
Oh no, I think maybe embellish a little. The first team that moved when Griffith's adopted son took over, Cal, it's kind of uncomfortable to say this, but he was somewhat dismayed with the demographics of the Washington market, and apparently confided in Thomas Boswell to not reveal till after his death that he wanted to move to a place that had more white people, and Minneapolis fit the bill. Now, the team was bad. They weren't getting a lot of fans. And the West was greener pastures for a lot of teams. So you have to take that with somewhat of a grain of salt. Because like when I looked at the Senators, I said, when was their last winning season? It was 1952. And when was the last year they had more than 10 games over 500? It was 1946. So like Ron said, the team was bad, and the stadium was old and small in the first iteration. So in some ways, I think it would have been inevitable if they moved. And yeah, the second team, what I heard was they were afraid, baseball was afraid that if they didn't put a team back in D.C. for the Congress to watch and go have beers together, they were going to go after the antitrust exemption.
That's how Kansas City got a team in '69 when the A's moved from Kansas City to Oakland. Stuart Symington kind of got in their American League's face and said, if you don't put an expansion team into Kansas City, we will take a look at your antitrust exemption. And that's how the Royals came to be so shortly after the A's moved west.
Yeah. And then the second team, like Ron said, they were really hastily assembled, and they were really bad. And Bob Short, his MO, I didn't know this till I researched the book, but he bought the Minneapolis Lakers and then moved them to Los Angeles and sold it to a guy named Jack Kent Cooke, ironically enough, who eventually became the Redskins owner with their 3 Super Bowls. So Short looked for, I don't know, what would you call those kind of guys today? He was a shark of some. He looked for sports franchises that he could buy and move, and because he knew he could leverage other places that wanted the teams. So one of the things that I researched in the book, when the Senators broke camp out of Pompano Beach, Florida in '69, they played 2 exhibition games. They were supposed to be in New Orleans, but they got moved to Arlington, Texas. There's a red flag right there, to Arlington, Texas, at Turnpike Stadium. And so I think Short intended to move the day he bought them. He intended to move them because the RFK Stadium lease was up September 30th, 1971, the day of the forfeit. So I think he always intended to move them no matter what. And like like you see the Oakland's ownership doing now with the possum in the visitors ballpark, they had to move the announcers. He let the stadium really go to pot. I remember going with my dad, and my dad's like, "What's all this trash doing here?" He was only cleaning the stadium after games, after homestands or series. So, and he raised ticket prices. Only the Yankees had higher. So he was trying. I think a lot of owners do that. I think Bob Irsay did that with the Colts. I think they try to drag their teams down and then blame the fans for not showing up to support them. So I think that's what happened in the second iteration. But then, I think the DC area got so wealthy and so prosperous and so large that baseball couldn't ignore them anymore. Then they had to bring the Nationals in. And they've been largely successful, I'd say. I mean, they're not in the top 5 in attendance, but they do pretty well.
They've drawn well. It's a nice stadium and that. So my follow-up with that, baby, the Twins found success almost immediately after leaving Washington.
They did.
They went to the World Series in '65, and that team really, if they had been divisional play in the '60s, would have won multiple divisional titles. They were that good. That team would have stayed.
Oh, no doubt.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of fans that are old enough to remember resented the expansion team, and even more when their old team made the World Series. Like, that should have been a DC team. Yeah.
I'm looking at some of the players here. Now, 69 was a little bit before my time. And in fact, when I was real young at that age, I was the hockey kid. But in the mid-'70s, I got into baseball and the whole bit. But I'm looking back at 69 here, as, we were getting ready for the interview. And I'm surprised at how many people not only do I know, but how old they were. I didn't realize Pete Rose was 28 in 1969. Because didn't he play for Philadelphia in the '80 World Series?
Yeah.
Which would have made him 39 or 40, right?
Oh, goodness. He played until 86. Should have retired in 78, but he played until 86.
But I didn't realize, because I remember following Rose, and I didn't realize that he was, that old in 69. Willie McCovey, he was 31.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I've watched Willie McCovey. I didn't realize he was that old. Frank Robinson was 33. Willie Stargell, 29. Boog Powell was only 27. But he played. All these guys played a long time. It seems like, because when I started picking up baseball in the mid '70s to late '70s, early '80s, a lot of these guys were still around. It's just that I didn't realize that they were that old. They were old meaning 30, but still, to be playing in the late 70s, early 80s, and be playing in 69, and you're not 21, I thought that was kind of neat. That's the first thing I noticed. And when I went through the list, I was like, holy cow, I know some of these guys, but they're a lot older than I thought they would be.
Yeah, like Frank Howard, 33 in 1969. I was blown away by that. And then that he changed his approach. How many guys in their 30s would?
Gaylord Perry was 30 years old.
Yeah.
Bob Gibson was 33. Fergie Jenkins, who I saw with the Red Sox, was 26 in 69. I mean, these guys
he's a hoot on Facebook, by the way, Fergie Jenkins.
Oh, is he? Louis
is.
Tiant was with Cleveland at 28 years old in 69. I had no idea that Louis Tiant even played with Cleveland, and I didn't think he was. And so he would have been 35 and 75, right? Or something like that.
If it wasn't for Gibson's magnificent 68, Tiant would be remembered as the poster child of the year of the pitcher.
Yeah.
Tiant had a tremendous year in Cleveland in 68, but was overshadowed by the fact that Gibson went,
It's a pretty intriguing series. I mean, just for myself, looking at some of the names here, I mean, you get Tommy John, was 26 playing for the Chicago White Sox.
Hadn't had a surgery yet, by the way.
I had no idea that's,
And Dave Tom would pitch, and Tommy would throw another 17 years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
It was pretty wild that some of the people that are here, and just how old they were. And again, I'm not saying that they were ancient, but I'm just saying that the people that I saw in the mid 70s to late 70s. So now we're talking 10 years later. They were a lot older than I thought they were actually. So that was kind of neat following that. So another question for you. All right. Do you have any thoughts of another book?
Yeah, I do.
Really?
I have a couple of ideas. I always, some are baseball and some are, well, actually, the baseball idea I had would actually tie in gaming. I had this idea. I read a book about the Senators' Negro League teams that they shared with the Homestead Grays. Brad Snyder wrote it. I forget the title. But I thought, what if, so the idea of this book would be, what if Eleanor Roosevelt convinces Frank, like, you've got to help the Senator.
It's time, essentially.
Yeah, we need, because she was pretty progressive. We need to get some black ball players on this team. So I thought, what if I had Josh Gibson, I think, was it Oscar Charleston, or maybe a few guys on the Grays, like 3 or 4 good players.
Yeah, but let me preface that by saying that I did not know until the last couple of years that Homestead had split between Pittsburgh and Washington, and then Josh Gibson played in D.C., and so that would have been a very natural fit.
Yeah, and they outdrew the Senators quite often, actually.
Wouldn't take much then.
So my idea was to take, and I started it a little bit, but then I got away from it, doing the 2019 version, take the 1941 Stratomatic cards and add the, like, maybe Page, Gibson, and Charleston.
Oh, my goodness gracious.
And see how they do. I did it for I had an 8-team Washington College World Series type tournament, and I did that for the tournament. And wouldn't you know it, their relief pitchers or their starting pitcher blew 3 ninth-inning leads, so they never made it to the two. So, but I thought that would be neat, and then write a fiction book based on the results, and then do some imagination of based on historical fiction, like because there would obviously be protests, there obviously be pressure, and so I thought that would be a neat fiction book, And then the 2007 Nationals, I don't know that it would sell very well, but that was a team that was predicted to win 39 games, and they actually won 73. How they did it, I have no idea.
Frank Robinson.
Yeah.
That's how they did it.
Actually, Manny Acta was the manager of that team.
Oh, was he? Wasn't Frank was gone by then?
Yeah, they fired him after 2006. So that was sort of a miracle that no one knows about, because all they did was escape last place. But how that team, if you look at their Stratomatic cards or any APA, or even Retrosheet, and how that team managed to win 73, I'll never know. I mean, Acta should have been manager of the year to get that team that far. I thought that might be an interesting book to interview some of those guys, like Robert Fick and others that were.
There were some characters.
There were some characters. Yeah, it was a club of misfits. Dimitri Young. Yeah, so very interesting group, and that was the last year in RFK.
Right.
So
pretty good. Any final questions or thoughts, Ron?
What do you follow now? Is baseball the only sport you'd write about, or?
Because of you guys, I've gotten into the play sports games. So I bought History Maker Golf, and I love that.
Oh, that's so fun.
I got their binge week. I bought it before they ran out of mats. So I was happy. So I've done a few tournaments, and that's been fun.
Have you played the full tournament? It takes me 4 to 5 hours to do like a full one properly. It is so rewarding when you do that, though. So have you done one?
I did. I did 2. I did one with the 2000 set, and it did take a long time. So I was like playing 3 holes and then putting it away and starting the next night. And then I did it wasn't a tournament, but it was an 18-hole match with the Presidents.
Oh, nice.
That
okay.
was fun. Red chips everywhere. I ran out of red chips.
Oh, yeah. When I did I did a couple of, start to finish things. And I think one I did one night. I think I started around 7 at night. Then you have dinner and you talk to the wife or whatever and come back to it. I think I finished at 1 a.m. And I had to finish because when you get down to those last 4 or 5 holes, it's like watching on TV.
Yeah.
It really is. You see who's in the lead, and the guy's going into the clubhouse, and this guy's like, well, I'm down by 2 at 18. I got to push my luck and try to pick up a stroke here. And then you see, I think I had Greg Norman hanging around for 4 or 5 holes. You just kind of hanging around, and next thing you know, the leaders just started to just drop off. And I think Norman ended up winning it for. I mean, he wasn't even in the final group, but it just felt like you were watching it on TV. It really was.
Yeah, it's a really neat game, and I want to try their soccer blast because I'm still friends with my intramural soccer team guys from college.
Oh, nice!
And so I want to create our team and take them against the 72-73 English Premier League.
That would quote unquote be a blast.
Yeah. I was the goalie, so sometimes I had a Ted Williams like temper. So I have to have a decide or die where does he have his composure or not have his composure?
That's funny.
So those, I'm still a Nationals fan. I'm going to take, they've been so bad lately, but I want to take, my idea for that was start in 15 and take Max Scherzer through 2019. Just replay all his starts.
I loved covering him. Oh my goodness. He was so we were supposed to remember where we are, so we remember where we were when they won the World Series. Actually, they hooked up the audio from my device to listen to Charlie Slows that night instead of Joe Buck. So where were you when they won Game 7 in Houston?
Oh, that's a great question. I was up in our guest room with my son, Christian, youngest son, showed me how. I didn't want to know how to watch the game live on my computer. And it was synced with the radio feed, Ron. So that was really cool because I had the radio feed on my at-bat, MLB at-bat.
Charlie and Dave are one of the best radio crews ever. And in my humble opinion, Bob Carpenter and FP Santa, whatever the heck his last name, are one of the worst TV announcers I'd ever heard. So I always, when I covered, it was Charlie and Dave trying to sync as much as I could. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. So when they got the last out, I jumped up and yelled for joy. And my son, Christian, who I always remember this because he's a teenager and this doesn't happen very often, he came over and hugged me because he was at the computer across the desk. And then my wife, we woke her up, so she came in. Then my two older sons called, one on my cell phone, one on my wife's cell phone, and my mother called. She's in her 80s now. She called on our landline. So it was like talking to three people at once. And it was just so joyful. And I told my wife I would get really into the Nationals, like almost too much, live and die with their. And I said, if they win the World Series, like all I wanted was a team to come back and be able to go to the first game. And I did with my oldest son, Timothy, and then have them win the World Series. And after that, I won't be as
you were good. It was all house money.
Is there any relationship between the Washington Senators and the Washington Nationals? Is there any connection at all? Or is it just the location?
There's a little bit, like Frank.
They tried.
Yeah, they try. They shy away a little bit because the team is associated more with failure than success. But they have a lot of 24 World Series stuff around the ballpark. Howard's thrown out the first pitch at some playoff games. Bosman threw out the first pitch at the last RFK. The best thing was when the team came back. They had a bunch of the old Senators take the field, including Joe Grisenda with the last ball from the forfeit. He kept the ball.
It only had been 30-some-odd years at that point. Now it's a lot longer, but...
Yeah, and they took the players' gloves out, and then the regular guys took the field, and they exchanged. So that was a really neat moment. But a lot of it they don't, Dave. It's very tepid, and they're kind of caught in that middle ground too, where baseball wants them to tie to the Expos, and a lot of Washington fans don't like that. So they kind of have a tightrope there,
and vice versa. A lot of people in Montreal want nothing to do with it. That was not celebrated up here.
Yeah, I was kind of wondering because it's in hockey you have the Winnipeg Jets, which is the second iteration or whatever you want to call it, iteration, because the Winnipeg Jets actually moved to Arizona and they're still there. And Atlanta moved their team to Winnipeg. So there's still the Winnipeg Jets in hockey. It's a completely different franchise. Now, they might play out of the same building and they're in the same city, but as far as any kind of real connection between the two, there's just not.
Yeah, that's kind of the Senators kind of went into the ether because the Texas Rangers don't do much either for them, which is understandable.
I've never seen anything that the Rangers have done.
Yeah, and so really the only way to keep them alive is to replay them on the tabletop.
The Twins would come through every once in a while and do the dress rehearsal game. So the first last spring training game, they would come through to make sure the vendors are all right there and all the new gadgets work. And so the year in 2017, it was the Twins that did that game. And that was interesting because you would think that with all the connections that Washington has, that the Twins would be the most obvious because they're the longest.
Yeah.
But no, not even close.
So the Twins were part of the Senators franchise?
The Senators were the Twins from 1901 to 1960.
Yeah.
Those were the Twins are the Washington Senators.
Yeah.
And then they've been in Minneapolis longer than they were in D.C. now.
So they moved. I'm just trying to follow this here. So I'm looking on the baseball reference here.
They moved to Bloomington for the 61 season.
And then the Senators kept the team?
No, they kept the name, but it was a brand new. It'd be like what Cleveland and Minnesota did in hockey, when the Barons merged with the North Stars.
Okay.
And sort of the Browns with the Ravens moving.
That's right. When Cleveland moved to Baltimore, the players went and became the Ravens, but the Browns colors and stuff remained in Cleveland, and they were guaranteed an expansion franchise.
Okay. So the Washington Senators, played from 1901 to 1960, moved to Minnesota, but the year that they moved, they
were immediately granted an expansion team,
and they called them the Washington Senators.
Right.
Yes.
That's really weird.
It would be like changing the cast, the entire cast of Cheers, not just Woody Harrelson replacing Coach.
I wonder how that went over, though, because you're talking about you're taking the team, you're moving them out, but the same day we have a new team, we're going to call it the Senators, all new guys, all new ownership.
I think that's one of the reasons why it never worked.
What kind of connection would you have with? It's like everyone just left.
There would be none. It would be like if the Bruins...
It's an expansion team, we're just going to call it the same? I mean, if the Bruins moved out and went to Quebec, and then they said, we're still going to have the Boston Bruins, it's just going to be all these new guys here. It's like, well, all the Bruins are in Quebec.
It would be like in 1995 when they tried to have the scrub players break the union. And so we did an entire spring training with these not Boston Red Sox, and we were within days of opening day, and here's all these, players that we had no idea who they were. They were going to be the Red Sox, the Yankees, the Orioles of that given year.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
They tried to get some of the old Senators. I think at the tail end of his career, Mickey Vernon may have played for the expansion Senators. But, there was no connection at all, Dave. In fact, a guy I know wrote a book called They've Stolen Our Team about the last year. And there was a lot of resentment, like Ron was saying, when they brought the new team in, like, there's no connection to Washington. That's just plopped in here.
The Mets were different. When the Dodgers and the Giants moved down to the West Coast for 58 and the Mets came back in 62, that was a National League town. So they were craving that. And they brought in the old washed-up Giants and Dodgers to do that. And so it was a love fest. That was not the case in D.C. at all.
No.
That's really unbelievable.
So, it would be like replacing the entire... It was kind of like that year of Saturday Night Live that we pretend doesn't exist after the original players left and in 1980, and they dropped the F-bomb and fired them. But it would be like your favorite TV show and everyone leaving. But wait. Yeah.
I do want to say one thing. I was kind of remiss in not mentioning Daryl Knowles, relief pitcher, made the All-Star team.
On those A's teams in the 70s, Dave, that you play every once in a while.
Okay.
So 1973 World Series, Daryl Knowles pitched in all 7 games. So Game 7, the Mets, the A's are up 5-1. Mets get a couple guys on base. There's a ball hit to Gene Tennis. He boots it. Raleigh Fingers is on the mound. One of the best closers, Hall of Fame. So Dick Williams says, okay, there's a lefty coming up, Wayne Garrett. I'm bringing in Knowles. So I talked to Daryl. He says, I've never been more nervous in my life.
I bet not.
Because I just replaced a world's, a Hall of Fame closer. And now I'm facing Game 7 tying run at the plate, 2 outs in the 9th. And he pitched all the other games, and he got them to pop up. And he said that was his greatest memory and his greatest moment in his entire career. And he had a long one. At the time he
pitched forever, yeah.
Yeah, he had appeared in more games as a left-handed reliever than anybody else. And that's since been broken many, many times. But
I would think, Dave, that maybe the closest comparison to the Senators of this era would be the Hartford Whalers. Because they were never going to be the golden child except for that. They were good in the WHA. But you got to remember, or you would know, the Orioles nearly won the American League in 60. They nearly won the American League in 64. They upset the Dodgers and won the World Series in 66. And 69 and 70, they went to the World Series. It would be like, they're 37 miles apart. And so they're having all the success up in Baltimore. And they weren't really loved in Baltimore. I mean, that was always a Colts town. And then coming through, and so you're not only have we changed everybody, but there's a better product an hour away.
Yeah.
And so it would very much be like the relationship between Hartford and the 3 New York teams and the Bruins. There was better teams around you, and very much a Whaler type vibe.
Yeah, I was looking. Baltimore seemed to get to a lot of World Series.
They were very good for a long time before they went to their first World Series.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, and they just pounded the Senators. They just, even in 69, they beat them 13 out of 18.
Well, they beat everybody a lot that year.
Yeah, they did.
So,
all right, Steve, give us the elevator pitch for your book. Why we would want to buy this book and where we can buy this book.
Sure. So you'd want to buy the book because you're going to hear stories of redemption and resilience and a time when a team made a town fall in love with them that had not really done so before. It was a love affair for one season when a bad team became a good team under the leadership of a legendary not just baseball player and manager, but a legendary human being, Ted Williams. And you can get the book from direct from the publisher at pocallpress.com. My book's in the lower left-hand corner of the screen. And you can go to Amazon.com and look for a whole new ball game. Or really the best thing to do is Google Stephen, Stephen J. Walker. And then you want the 50th anniversary edition. Sometimes both will pop up. Or you can get it on Kindle. You can get the paperback or the Kindle. And you want the one with Frank Howard on the cover on opening day against the Yankees. And it's got 48 reviews. Most are 5 stars. So I think it's a really good book and a great memory of a simpler time in the world and in baseball. And if you like to play sports games and you're into 1969, it'll help enrich that whole replay for you.
It is a season that intrigues a lot of people, especially the Strat, probably because it's the Mets season. But of most of the past seasons, 69 is one we hear an awful lot about.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a good one.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Stephen, thank you for being on the show. We look forward to hearing more from you if you have any more books coming out. But now I'm intrigued with 69. After all this talk about 1969 baseball, now you got me all thinking. Now I got to go buy some more seasons. Thank you so much.
Oh yeah, if APA has it, after you have your Saturday interview, pick it up, give it a whirl.
I might have to.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you guys. I love your show.
Thank you.
A lot of success. I know you're doing really well. I hope that continues because this is a great hobby. And it helps bring people together.
Yes, it does. So
thank you.
All right. So Stephen Walker, the author of A Whole New Baseball Game, the 1969 Washington Senators. Get this now on Pocall Press or Amazon. Make sure you pick up the 50th edition. Stephen, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you, Dave. And thank you, Ron.
Thank you.
Well, that was a really good interview, Ron.
Yes, it was.
I learned a lot about 1969 baseball.
It was a fascinating year. It really was one of those, besides an expansion year, really was a year of change, first year of the divisional playoffs, and all. It really just kind of set the stage for baseball as you and I know it today.
I still think it's really odd that a team would leave and they'd bring in an expansion team and call them the exact same name.
I think it was just a case of, as we said in the interview, I think because it was Washington, there was a lot of political pressure to put a team there.
I guess I get it, but even in the American Hockey League, when they had the Springfield Indians, it used to be, and the team actually left Springfield, but they said, you know something, Springfield is a key unit here in the American Hockey League. It's where it's based out of, so we have to have a team in Springfield. So they brought a team in. They called them the Falcons. You know what I mean? They gave them a new name. But at least they had a team. But so this was kind of weird to go Washington Senators and have none of the Washington Senators on the team.
Yeah. Crazy. It's just crazy.
It was kind of fun. But that was a great interview there. Anyways, way to get a hold of us here is digitaltodice.com is the website. 978-751-DICE is the text line. digitaltodice@yahoo.com is the email. And over on Facebook, facebook.com/groups/digitaltodice. And we should be back next week with a normal show. We'll get back into what we've been playing and, the weather, as we normally do with our normal shows. So that'll all be back here next week.
Maybe the sun will pop out by the time we tape again.
Boy, yeah, it's been a lot of rain.
No, we've had a ton.
It's been good for the lawn, but you need a little bit of sun in there once in a while.
Yes.
So anyway, all righty. I'm Dave.
I'm Ron.
I'll talk to everybody later.
Bye-bye.